Hi everybody, welcome to the Privacy Podcast by Maiden. We're going to have some great guests over the next few weeks. Make sure you tune in and hit that subscribe button, and welcome to the show. And we're joined today by Evin McMullen from Billions. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's fantastic to be here. You're one of my favorite people in the space. You have a great project. And actually, we're doing an event recently together where we organized a debate about privacy. And there were two sides to that debate. And I thought it might be interesting to unpack some of the kind of learnings that came out of that debate, because it was really a classic clash between sort of maximalists and more incrementalists or compromises on the other side. So what did you take away from that debate, and how much did it kind of reflect this wider debate in the community we're seeing?
So the proposal or topic for discussion in this debate was the sort of resolution that in order to achieve scale of adoption for decentralized technologies, that privacy necessarily cannot be absolute, that it must be compromised in some cases, in some spaces, because otherwise such an absolute requirement would prohibit such scale. I think that is, pragmatic and realistic to every technology the world has ever seen in the history of humankind.
Right.
Especially when it comes to exposing data, sharing data, interacting with other parties in both physical and digital space. The ability to be perceived and engaged necessarily demands some amount of exposure, such that one can be discovered and take receipt of whatever that form of engagement is, be it transaction or content. I jokingly sometimes say that I was raised Orthodox Ethereum,
right.
in that I had the privilege of working full time in decentralized technology starting from about 2017, and I think over the maturation of this ecosystem, as technologies went from philosophical ideas and magical thinking to real adoption and scaling of infrastructure, the reality of switching costs, the effort and context and financial cost involved with adopting a new technology laid bare the need for meeting people, businesses, ecosystems where they are, and thus compromising from the design that originated in a vacuum based on philosophical underpinnings to real execution. And so, while I respect and value the views of my opponents in this debate very much, I, try to approach my current perspective in a manner that is informed by my lived experience of bringing decentralized technologies to market and to scale, which necessarily requires that we acknowledge the containers of jurisdiction in which they exist, right. The laws and regulations that enable or prohibit certain forms of data sharing, and the reality of an increasingly connected world where more than half of our online and on-chain interactions now come from unidentified, unaccountable, non-human actors.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, how has the kind of job of providing privacy to individuals in identity changed over the time you've been working on this? I mean, it's sort of an exponential problem of bots invading our systems now these days.
So maybe I'll start off with the kind of a level set for the definition of privacy.
Yeah.
Helen Nissenbaum refers to privacy as sort of sharing, within a given context, sort of loosely. And I think about privacy more as the absence of disclosure. Privacy is not a product. It is not an action. It is an end state that is achieved as the result of disclosure or absence of disclosure. And so if we think about it that way, privacy really becomes a function of the action of consent given by the subject of information and by the container in which such sharing, may occur, or the technologies used in order to perform disclosure. In the time that I've been working in this space, we have seen a massive evolution in terms of the technologies available to obscure or disclose data. Now, the idea of disclosure is not, I show you everything or I show you nothing, but rather with things like zero-knowledge proofs, we have the ability to prove traits and capabilities without revealing the underlying qualifying data that makes them so. To get, very tangible in terms of progress that I've had the privilege to see, If I think back to, 2018, when I first started working in the privacy and verifiable data space, if you wanted to generate a zero knowledge proof, use math to be able to assert something about your data without revealing it, you would be sitting at a desktop computer for 30 minutes, crossing your fingers and praying that something was going to happen. And sometimes it did. But the reliability of those processes, the hardware requirements, and obviously the speed were unfit for the everyday experiences that we enjoy online and in applications. And now today, thanks to the amazing work of many teams, including ours, backed by the Ethereum Foundation, you can generate a zero knowledge proof on your mobile device in less than 2 seconds while you're walking down the street with okay cell service. In fact, you don't even need cell service at all to be able to do that. And so bringing down the hardware requirements, bringing down the time of proof generation, and adding developer tools and utility to make this process much easier, I think has been transformative in the space of privacy. First example that I encountered that painted the picture of what this could be, this future state that we now live in, actually originated in about 1997. This professor, Larry Lessig at Harvard, now the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for the Internet, I believe at their law school, posited that at some point in the future, you would be able to go to an age-restricted place like a bar, a restaurant, 21 plus, and instead of showing your entire driver's license to the door person, revealing your eye color, your organ donor status, your place of residence. Instead, you'd be able to pass them a mathematical proof, some evidence that you are qualified to enter the establishment, not revealing your date of birth or any of those other additional details. And so the vision for these capabilities has been quite longstanding. But now with these recent technological advancements, we can make them so.
Right. So how do you see ZK proofs and that technology applying in the real world? And who are going to be the early adopters of these systems, do you think?
So we have already seen a remarkable amount of early adoption, both in the independent developer, decentralized technology ecosystem, as well as more recently in government and enterprise. So in my work at Billions Network, we steward the most popular ZK libraries on Earth, supporting folks from independent developers all the way through government and institutions. And we have seen a rapid increase in demand for these capabilities, especially around Sybil resistance, proving bots from humans, or age-based access control. And I think the accelerants to these technologies, especially for regulated entities, so businesses, institutions, governments, has moved along with the pace of regulation, but also the pace of risk. And so I think zero knowledge proofs and privacy technologies are adopted out of requirement. They are rarely added as a novelty benefit or an unnecessary feature in use cases where they're implemented. So whether for private payments, whether for safety of minors and underage users, whether for financial compliance, we're starting to see a roar of demand in all these spaces. But it is surprising to me that some of the earliest adopters with the most, effortful exploration are actually not the, creative individual developers you'd imagine, but actually institutions and governments.
Do you have maybe a favorite example you could share with us?
Certainly. So our team has had the privilege of working closely with many governments around the world as they tackle and explore technologies like zero knowledge proofs. One such program is our participation in the European Union blockchain sandbox, where we're able to demonstrate new capabilities, such as age-based access control, where instead of revealing the entirety of an individual's biometrics to a service provider or sharing a copy of their government ID, instead they can pass along a zero knowledge proof asserting their qualification, their age qualification, without revealing any of that underlying data. In addition to that, we've seen, a really incredible uptake and creativity in government use cases that are being explored around the GCC, and even right here in the United States, where laws like the Genius Act and the Clarity Act hold space for privacy-preserving verification technologies that have not yet been explicitly defined.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So do you see a sea change in how regulators are thinking about these new privacy-preserving technologies? And could we see a day when they would allow a replacement of the kind of KYC, AML sort of regime with these technologies?
Most certainly.
Yeah.
If you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I might have felt differently because my conversations with regulators and government leaders at that time usually started with, let me explain Bitcoin. Then we'll explain Ethereum. And then, now we've got the initial foundational building blocks, but the level of literacy and maturity of regulatory understanding around these technologies has just grown explosively. In fact, earlier today, I had the opportunity to meet SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce. I think she has been an outstanding example of, deep understanding, rigorous insight, and holding space for the ways in which these new technologies can benefit citizens. I definitely see a similar progress in governments in Asia and in the Middle East and the GCC region. But I think the unique challenge in the United States is the fragmented jurisdictions, state by state regulation. So while I am optimistic, I am measured about the speed of adoption, with that type of challenge.
So in order to have a change in this regime, you would have to have a state-by-state endorsement of it as well as at the federal level?
In fact, we're already starting to see it. So due to state-by-state age-based access controls, there are some digital service providers, operators of websites and content platforms that choose to serve some U.S. states, but have removed their services from others due to the difference in what that access control is allowed to be. I would also be remiss to note that the concept of consumer protection, especially protection of minors, has long been a challenge in digital space where our everyday internet lacks a human identity layer or a standard method of verification. We are now on the precipice of, I think, one of the most important moments in the growth and history of the internet as it pertains to privacy because of age-based access control.
Right.
In jurisdictions around the world, Australia, the United Kingdom, Spain, and others, we are starting to see social media bans for users under the age of 16 and other types of requirements for content platforms. Now, in their spirit, I think such regulations are appropriate given the harms to children that can be exacted by exposure to certain content, especially at a young age. However, I am also deeply concerned that this can be used as coverage for regulatory overreach in terms of censorship and overreach in terms of overcollection of data. One of the kind of Bibles that I return to in terms of identity system design often is actually from 2005. There's a gentleman named Kim Cameron, who is the head of identity at Microsoft, and set forth a framework called the 7 Laws of Identity. Okay. Best practices that you should follow if you want to minimize risk and harm to human beings in building an identity system. And these, largely have considerations around privacy and control. So user consent and control. It's a very important pillar there, as well as, the one I want to focus on now is minimal disclosure for constrained use, meaning that your data should be shared on a need-to-know basis. Right. Only the amount and type required to facilitate your desired interaction, and the output of data that you share should only be leveraged in service of that intentional interaction, as opposed to repackaged and used for other positions and other opportunities later. And I think we are now seeing the flagrant violation of most of those best practices when it comes to modern identity systems, certainly built in the decentralized and agentic space. And so I think, we as builders should all take this as a call to action, not only for principled design, but for, logical business operations to protect our users, to abide by the law, and to do so in a manner that is not going to create a ticking time bomb.
Right. So we've seen these flagrant transgressions of our rights. I mean, do you see that kind of being overturned by regulation or by consumer choice in choosing different types of systems?
So I think it is unreasonable for us to expect consumer choice to prefer more high-friction, complex, less easy-to-use experiences. I think the two forcing functions that we will see in terms of evolution and change are, as you note, regulatory. But on the other side of that, I think the cost of compliance to businesses is becoming an outsized risk. Right. Now, what I mean by that is that, most websites, content platforms, businesses were not built as storage mechanisms for their users' most sensitive data. Content platforms, social media platforms were not built in their primary purpose to store copies of passports or driver's licenses.
Right.
And so in some jurisdictions where the collection of such vital data is now basically a requirement, we are putting an extreme cost on these businesses to store, protect, ensure, be able to, describe the use of this data, which is largely outside of their original objectives as a company.
Right.
And so I think as we start to see the mounting risk and cost of such practices harm small to medium-sized businesses, requiring them to add headcount to be able to tackle a very challenging set of issues, as well as, adding an immense amount of risk to their operations, I think that is going to become a forcing function as well.
Right. I'm interested to ask you this question because you're such a good communicator around privacy. And I was thinking about my mother. I was having a conversation with her, and she's a little older. And I was saying I'm working for this privacy startup. And she said, "Why would you care about privacy? Do you have something to hide?" Which is sort of something people often say in retort to privacy sort of activation. What would you say to someone like my mother who said, "Why should I care about privacy?"
So, I think it's possible that your mother might be of an age where she remembers more closely or is aware of historical events that have happened around the world where data about citizens, about individual human beings, has been collected for, earnest purposes and then has been abused later on to harm them. For example, we are aware of the events during World War II, where citizen data, census data, was then utilized to limit the freedoms of and, eventually exact great harm on vulnerable populations. Similarly, we are aware of historical events such as the genocide in Rwanda, where, ethnic associations were documented in a clear text and accessible manner. That data was accessed inappropriately and then used to harm people.
Right.
Even here in the United States, with restrictions on access to women's health services, there can be significant consequences to seeking medical services as pursued by revealing chat histories that some individuals thought were private between them and other people, or with LLMs or AI-enabled services. And so, I think what I would invite your mother to think about is whether her own individual liberty and agency is something that she values, or whether she would prefer to defer that to private enterprise or to public regulation. I come from a family of immigrants, and my family members, some of them have grown up without vital documents because of the failings of their government to be able to provide that stability and security. The absence of privacy in their experiences, or the failure of their most powerful entities to maintain their security, the security of their data, has wreaked havoc on their lives for many, many decades since. So the privilege of not being concerned about the privacy of our data is a function of our faith in the structures around us and their positive intent. But we have seen time and time again that cannot always be guaranteed, especially when that intent and control happens outside of the public realm.
So, Evin, talk to us about Billions, the project. What's on the roadmap? What are you thinking about at the moment?
So, Billions Network is the first universal human and AI network built with mobile-first verification, so that you can prove things like the fact that you're a person, not a bot, a unique human being over a certain age in a certain country, KYC status, and more, without revealing your underlying data. And now, as of a few days ago, we make it even easier for you to extend those capabilities to your AI agents, such that they can prove they are acting on behalf of a real human, on behalf of a human with a certain KYC status or affiliation to an entity or enterprise. We are here, simply put, on a mission to save the internet in the age of AI.
Nothing too small then.
Well, it is, as my mother likes to tell me, set no small goals.
Okay.
But I think this is perhaps one of the most pressing challenges that we face as a society today. The World Economic Forum recently noted that the largest risk to humanity is geoeconomic conflict, and in a close second is misinformation as enabled in the age of AI, where more than 51% of our online and on-chain interactions come from non-human actors with no accountability.
Right. So how does the age of AI and agents impact this question of privacy? Does it make it a bigger problem for us?
I think it is a bigger opportunity, let's say. Now, with the dawn of agentic browsing, where instead of clicking through websites and manually searching, we can enjoy the experience of the internet as enabled by an agent intermediary, a new interface to help us, guide through our digital experiences. If we think back to the, early implementations of even chatbot technology in the 1970s at Harvard, there are, many anecdotes about the young women who coded these tools. And then they themselves shared their most intimate secrets with these chatbots, interacting with them as though they were human. In fact, in one anecdote, a professor was trying to read over the shoulder of his assistant, who then covered the screen with her hand and said, "Professor, this is private. I'm chatting with Eliza." And so I think that experience, that deeply human experience of a personified interface inviting us to share quite a lot about our lives, rings true today, where we're seeing experimenters give their credit card numbers to agents or share passwords, massive amounts of data to these unaudited, non-deterministic, stochastic actors. So the potential risk service is infinite. But the new point of entry and of consent is becoming a familiar digital butler. And so the cognitive exhaustion that we are about to feel as a society, I think, is immense, where we need to double check, to mistrust what our senses tell us in favor of logical thinking about how our expression might be used in the future. And while I don't have a great solution for human exhaustion, right, I think that thoughtful regulation and design can go a long way there.
Right. So it sounds like we need a more sort of self-sovereign version of AI where we're not giving up all of our identity and all our secrets in order to use these services.
That is my impulse, is that we need a better version, but also I think we need better regulation, such that we don't have to make a choice based on personal preference of safety, but rather we can freely exist in a digital environment where safety is a priority of the design.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for being on the Privacy Podcast. It's Evin McMullen. Thanks for being here.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you all, and we'll see you on Chain.